So thank you very much for your kind words, and now I don't know, I'm a bit scared by the responsibility of being the first speaker in this series of lectures. The other colleagues that have been invited are really prominent scholars. So, well, thank you very much for thinking of me, and I hope that you will enjoy the lecture. So I'm going to talk about inequality and the social conflict. In fact, I'll take an angle that's going to be a bit different. In fact, one of the themes is going to be that instead of the standard view that economic inequality brings class conflict and that what you observe is class conflict, then I'm going to say that in fact most of what you are observing is not class conflict, it's ethnic conflict. By ethnic I mean motivated by apparently by things not related to income or class belonging, but then I'm going to show, in fact empirically, that in fact all these ethnic conflicts that we are seeing, in fact, are in disguise are truly economic conflict. They are class conflicts. So that if there are ethnic conflicts not per se, but it's because the groups, it's easier to group as an ethnic group if you want to improve your social position or your economic position. We're going to see this. Now, in fact, this is part of a very long shot research program that we started more than 20 years ago. And it's all on this theme of social polarization, social conflict. And what it has in common is that our approach is take this issue that apparently is the clearest example of irrationality, rage, and hatred, and then see whether we can make this compatible with rational behavior, so that I'm going to give you a few concepts that are going to be useful, and then I'm going to show you how we can turn the analysis of social conflict into a mathematical model, and we are going to examine the properties of this model. You will understand, I guess. And then eventually we are going to take the implications of this model, what we learn from this theoretical model, and we're going to contrast this with data. And then we're going to see whether the predictions we obtain from the model are validated by what we observe. So this is going to be the structure of the lecture. So, well, first, just a bit of information. So the idea that there is social conflict, well, we learn, we read that there is conflict here and there, but how important this is? Well, it is very important. So here, for instance, we have the data that since 1945, then there have been 25 interstate wars, but 240 civil wars, and here I don't include the ones that started in the last 2 years. So you will see that the number of casualties is far more than the number of casualties in international wars. Furthermore, civil wars are the cause of forced displacement. So 42 million people in 2008 were estimated to live out of their countries of origin because of civil wars. It has huge human costs, economic costs. There are various estimates. The last one I've seen, they estimate that in 2007, the gross domestic product of the world will be 14% higher had there not been any conflict since 1960. Well, these counterfactuals have to be taken with care, but just to give you an idea of how important this is. And then just how much conflict intensity, let me see just how much conflicts are there. We can see here the conflicts from 1946 till 2008. So we see that the total number of conflicts is 35, 36 active in 2008, of which then it turns out that international conflicts are 0. This is the yellow part. The red part is civil wars, and the black part is internationalized civil wars. So civil wars in which some external power participates. So most of the conflict that we are seeing first is civil wars. Second, that you see that this is not decreasing. No? We are in very high levels of civil war since the mid-70s. Okay, now another question is that we may think that this essentially is a problem that happens in Africa. Well, no, this happens everywhere. Here it's by regions of the world, and then the lower part, this is Asia, that in fact we see that that's where most of conflicts take place. This is Africa, but then again, no, we have Middle East, we have Europe, and then we have the Americas. So conflict is a bit all over the place. And then if you take into account the total population living in those areas, so more or less per capita, it's not a great difference in the different regions. So this is a truly global problem. So there are two facts, no, that are relevant when we see all this conflict. Is that first is that, as I mentioned, that within country conflicts account for most of what we see, most of the deaths and damage. And the second thing is that, in fact, most of internal conflicts appear to be ethnic in nature. So they are based either on religion or nationalism or just ethnic differences rather than class differences as we used to think. In fact, during most of the 20th century, then we have thought of conflict, possibly under the influence of Marx, as essentially driven by class differences. So empirically, we just expected to find the relationship between income inequality and the occurrence of social conflict. But then it turns out that this has been an impossible task. There have been dozens of, especially political scientists, that have tried to find a solid relationship between income inequality and social conflict, but nothing. There has been no clear result. And then this has been driven the profession a bit to the despair. As I'm going to argue at the end, it may well be that what has happened is that instead of building a sufficiently rich model of social interactions, and then from there to derive exactly what is the role of inequality and how this materializes into conflict. In fact, most of this literature has just taken occurrence of civil violence, has dropped their data on Gini index of economic inequality and tried to find whether there was a correlation between the two. They have not succeeded, but maybe because the approach was just too simple-minded. So, in fact, we are trying to be a bit more sophisticated when we talk about ethnic conflict. But of course, there is also an aspect of class conflict that it is important, and it's behind what I'm going to say in this talk, is that in fact this is kind of has a two-sided, two-edged sword, that on the one hand, of course, being poor and seeing people rich, then this may create resentment. But then, of course, if we are all poor, it means that we are not going to have the means of successfully challenge the rich part of society. So it is not easy to open a class conflict and win a class conflict. However, if it turns out that you may, say, disguise an economic conflict in form of ethnic conflict, then maybe the possibilities first of feeling identified with your own group, seeing clearly which is your opponent, are much easier, and therefore it's much easier to be successful. If you say all green people are being exploited by blue people because you see you are green, you see all the green, you see the blues, whereas when you talk about rich and poor, then it's harder to see. Maybe your brother earns less, maybe an uncle gets more, maybe your cousin is unemployed. So then the division is not as neat as along ethnic lines, and therefore what we are going to gear at and obtain at the end is that the ethnic differences are instrumentally used in order to obtain either economics or political gains. But this, let's wait till the end of the talk. So As I said, in fact, ethnic conflicts, so most conflicts appear to be ethnic in nature. In fact, most of the professionals in political science, they have come to the conclusion that, in fact, ethnicity is the main driver of conflict. And then very well-known people in political science have made really strong statements like Horowitz, that maybe is the one that has studied most cases of civil wars, and then says that this the Marxian concept of class then doesn't find support in the data, and then Marx's conception applies in Africa a bit more as a prophecy on ethnic fulfillment rather than with class fulfillment. And also another two very well-known political scientists then end up with a conclusion that after after the post-Cold War, then we have seen an eclipse of the left-right ideological axis, and that now political conflict doesn't follow any longer those lines. It is more based on ethnic identities that try to violently challenge the power and try to obtain benefit from the conquest of power. So seeing all this widespread nature of conflict, then there are a number of questions we can ask ourselves. One is, well, do ethnic divisions predict conflict? So when we see countries that have large ethnic diversity, are those countries more exposed to social conflict? Or how do we conceptualize those divisions? So what do we mean by ethnic diversity in a society? How we measure this? Then is it true that ethnic cleavages and conflicts are related? How do we interpret, if we find a relationship, how do we interpret the link between ethnicity and conflict? Then is this driven by, say, a primordial view that there is ancestral hatred between ethnic groups and that's it, and that's what drives things? Or maybe we can find a more rational explanation, saying that in fact ethnicity, as I advanced, is used instrumentally to achieve political power or economic gains. So those are questions that we'll try to answer. Now, first contribution to the study of the role of ethnic composition into civil conflicts, well, was due to all these people. These people contributed: Collier, Huffler, Ferron and Leighton, Miguel, many other people. And the final results were a bit disappointing once more. So all, after studying different cases, agreed that ethnic differences seem to be very important to explain social conflict. But when it comes to try to test this against data, then the results are disappointing. In fact, then the main questions, well, first go to the main questions and then we'll go to why this has been disappointing. So the main questions raised by this literature were, first, what drives ethnic conflict? Is it greed that just want to control, to get grants and get control of the sources, especially natural resources? Or is it grievance? So that means that in fact they try to revenge from ancestral grievances. Then the other main question is, why is ethnicity relevant? Then one line is what it's called primordialism, which again says, well, this is just because they had been hating each other for hundreds of years, that's it, and that's the end of the story. Or then there is the other line, which is what we call instrumentalist, which is ethnicity is used as a marker to achieve other goals. So it's not that because you hate other people, just because it's easy to identify members of that particular group or the other group. So let me go first on how ethnic diversity is measured. So a standard index there, in fact the most popular used in the literature, is what has been called the Fractionalization Index. This strange expression there. N is the proportion of the population belonging to ethnic group I, and then we are multiplying the share over 1 minus this share and then adding over all. But all this simply means that we are computing what is the probability that if we take two people randomly in a society, what is the probability that they belong to different ethnic groups. Now, this again has been tested, whether empirically the degree of ethnic fractionalization could be associated with conflict. The results were not good, but in a way that's no surprise, because this measure, I think, doesn't capture well the type of ethnic structure or class structure that might be most prone to social conflict. And the reason is very simple. In that case, so the degree of fractionalization increases the more ethnic groups there are. In fact, it's maximal when every person is of a different ethnic group, because then the probability that picking two persons belong to different ethnicity is 1. However, we all agree that if everybody is of a different ethnicity, then the likelihood that there is ethnic conflict is 0. So here I talk about, when I say ethnicity, I don't mean exactly in the narrow sense of ethnic groups. I mean any grouping that is not class-based. So this could be religious groups, nationalistic groups, okay? So it's just the complement of economic groupings, okay? So now I'm going now to present a notion that seems more appropriate when we want to capture the potential conflict, and that's what we call the measure of polarization in a distribution. In fact, this notion, it's the first contribution that Ray and I, we did, and I'm going to explain very rapidly what the essence of the notion, and in fact this is applicable in fact to analyze income distributions, wealth, distributions of political position in the political spectrum, left to right, of course ethnic polarization that we will measure. So let me give you a bit the intuition. So I'm going to use as a motivation now income. So suppose that this is a distribution of income in society. It doesn't look like this, but anyway, so that there is here, it's mid incomes, that there were more people. Then up to here, you have high incomes, low incomes. And then there is a principle that is very popular in economics, and in fact it's satisfied by all indices of concentration or dispersion, as you wish, which is called the principle of progressive transfers. This principle says that if we start with a distribution of incomes and then we take income from a person and give it to a poorer one, then inequality will come down, okay? So, and then it turns out that all inequality measures satisfy this property, variance or Gini index. So, in fact, so that this principle says is if we take away the money, for instance, here from the rich people, there will be fewer people, no? We are moving from the black to the blue distribution. So there will be fewer rich, and then there will be fewer poor, because the poor will receive that income, and all these are going to populate the mid incomes, okay? So there's going to be a concentration of the distribution. And then looked at this, then it seems very intuitive that that doing those distribution or these changes in the distribution imply more concentration, imply less inequality. Consider, however, now let's think of, well, the drawing is a bit different, but doesn't matter, it's the same. But now suppose that what we did is the following, is we take the upper part of the distribution and then we give money from the very rich to the upper middle class, so that we form a more homogeneous and larger rich class. And we do the same among the poor. So we take the lower middle class and we transfer money to the very poor. So now we have a more well-defined poor group. There are people that have incomes that are more similar to each other. So imagine that we just go on doing this, so that in the end we have just here a large group of rich and a large group of poor. Now, in fact, all measures of inequality will tell you that inequality has been falling here, that there is less inequality all the time. However, of course, if you think of a society where there are two well-defined groups, then it's clear, it seems more conflictual than the initial one, even though there is less inequality. So what has happened here? That now here, groups have become more well-defined. So the being rich has become more clear, more visible, and being poor has become clearer, more visible. So social groups have formed more clearly. Again, I put here the example in in income, but you can as well think these as political positions left to right, and therefore we compare two distributions of population over positions in the political spectrum. And then again, no, if we can have these concentrations that apparently the degree of inequality in political positions has come down, but then of course what we would see that is maybe political is going to be more conflictual, society completely divided in big left, big right, rather than a society with more spread out political beliefs, in spite of the fact that from the pure measurement point of view, we will record less inequality in political positions if there is this concentration. So then the idea is, well, let's bring all these ideas into something concrete, and then we developed a way of measuring polarization, and this is the following. So we started thinking that what the main cause of social conflict is social antagonism between individuals in society. And now just think that, so we want to define what is antagonism between two members of society, and then we just, no. It's just the button is just too close to the, okay, the pointer is just too close to the other button. So now the point is, well, imagine that the antagonist fell by an individual I towards an individual in group J. Now it depends on the sense of identity of this individual I on its own group, and then this depends on the group size. And then it also depends on how far this person sees the member of the other group. And all this, just think of this very unspecific. There is just is a function of the size of your group and how distant you feel from the other. So then we can conceive as the degree of social polarization just the sum of all the interpersonal antagonists that there are in society. Okay, so let's define this. And but so far we have found something that is impossible to use, which is that total polarization is the sum of this thing, this strange function. So now what we did there is just to propose three axioms, three properties that we thought that any measure of polarization should satisfy. And then from there we derived that in fact there is a unique measure of polarization that satisfies these views. And this measure is this one, or the equivalent in continuous distributions, these would be integrals. So let me just go through this to get an intuition, and then I move to the modeling. So, because we are going to use polarization, that's why I stop here. So the first axiom is, well, suppose that we observe a distribution with this form, and now this distribution shifts in this particular way, so that everybody comes more concentrated towards the middle. Then say, well, if this happens, I think that the second distribution, the blue one, is less polarized than the first one, because there is more concentration of everybody towards the center. Okay? Now let's suppose that we observe this distribution. Suppose this is just rich, middle class, and poor, or right, center, and left. And now what we do is the same, but only on the two extreme distributions. So the rich have become more similar to each other, the poor have become more similar to each other, or the right have become more homogeneous around the same central point and the left the same. Then the idea is, well, if we observe this change, we expect that the measure of polarization should show that polarization has not come down, that maybe has gone up, because the extremes have become more cohesive, more similar to each other. Okay? And now just the third axiom, just suppose that we observe this distribution. Again, suppose this is rich, upper middle class, lower middle class, poor, or extreme right, center left, extreme left. And now suppose that we observe that the two center distributions have gone apart, so towards the extremes, the two. And then we'd say, well, I think that any reasonable measure of polarization should record that polarization has gone up, no? Because the two that were in the center have gone more to the extremes. Now then it turns out that, well, if we accept this very generic thing that polarization is the sum of interpersonal antagonists, then it turns out that there is only one index that can measure polarization, which is the one I'm writing there, which is this double sum over the the size of the one group to a power 1 plus alpha. In fact, we obtain in one of the solutions that alpha has to be 1, so it's the group size to the square multiplied by the size of any other group times the distance felt between the group I and group J, and this is the only measure of polarization that satisfies the 3 axioms. So it's a neat way of obtaining an index from an intuitive notion of what this index should be capturing. So then how polarization does relate to conflict. So now let me build a model of conflict. And before we get into the specific model, let me just tell you a few words how one can abstract from all the lots of things that are involved in a situation of social conflict to turn it into a model that one can operate with. So the first idea is, well, in society there are differences of interests, and this is a fact. This happens in every society. But in fact, typically we have a mechanism to nevertheless reach a collective decision in view of the different positions, the different interests. For instance, we can have voting, and then we accept that what the majority says, then this is implemented. So in view of a particular distribution of the interests of the population, then here is a mechanism that gives us an outcome. Now, a situation of conflict is a situation where there is part of society that challenges whatever mechanism there is to turn these different interests in society into a collective decision. Okay? So that means that if the mechanism is challenged and therefore there is no alternative mechanism to make a collective decision, that means that the outcome becomes probabilistic. We don't know for sure what's going to happen if a social group or various social groups just challenge the working of the political system that has the role of turning these different views into a common decision. So we have that individuals face a probabilistic situation where different groups may end up controlling power. So we have on the one hand what each group would like best, then what is the probability that each group reaches power and imposes the view, and then we want different groups to be able to take actions in favor of their interests. And for instance, groups can spend resources, can be time, can be spare human lives, can be money, trying to reinforce their position and make it more probable that they win. So the model, that's going to be the model. So the model, there's going to be different policies that different groups would like to implement. There is no rule, so then this is seen as something probabilistic, and the probability of success depends on the relative amount of resources that each group is burning, trying to push things to their side. And that's the model I'm going to describe. So this is the entire model. We're going to have a number of groups, call it M, groups in conflict. Then we are going to have the population size of each group. It's going to be NI, is going to be the total number of people of group I, and then the sum is the total population in the country. Then individuals decide the resources that they want to burn in trying to favor their interests. These resources are going to have a cost to them, so that to the benefit of conquering power will have to deduce the costs they will incur because they are fighting. Maybe there will be foregone income because people that join militia or demonstrations or whatever became militants, then they didn't have a salary any longer, and therefore all this is a cost that group is facing. And then this capital RI is going to be the sum of the total contributions of members of group I. K is each member, each person of group I. And I'm going to call capital R the total resources that society is going to burn. And in fact, I'm going to take this as an indicator of intensity of conflict. So how much society is ready to burn just to push things, everybody in its favor. Now, the probability of conquering power, as I said, we are going to assume that is just the relative amount of resources that each group is using, is putting on the table in this conflict of interests. And then, as I said, the winning group will control the government, and then it's going to decide both on the general policies in the country that will have a general effect, what we in economics call is a public good. For instance, they say, well, from now on, we are going to prohibit, I don't know, abortion or gay marriage. And then this is going to affect the entire population independently of the size of each group. And also they'll have control on economic resources, and therefore they can divert part of these resources to favor their group. Okay, so there are going to be these two possible decisions. So as I said, first there will be this kind of public good type of prize or benefit. Then this is going to be based on two components. This UIJ is the following. So suppose that there are different groups that want to conquer power. Suppose in a country there are, I don't know, Protestant, Catholics, and Muslims. And then I would say, well, okay, I am a Catholic, I would prefer to control the country, and then I'm going to prohibit abortion. But then if I compare how it will be worse if a Muslim rules the country or a Protestant rules the country, then I may say, well, I would prefer to do it myself, but I will be more relaxed if, I don't know, a Muslim is in government or a Hindu is in government than if a Protestant is in government. But this surely was the case 300 years ago, but I mean, not now. So that means that we may distinguish between what is our feeling if each other group is in power, okay? Because they have different policies that they're going to follow. The one I like the most is mine, but I may dislike more one than the other. And this is captured by this UIJ, and then this is meant to represent what is the basic cultural distance between every ethnic different group, okay? To this, then we have a scale factor of pi, in the sense that given a cultural distance, then this might be just blown up by the situation. For instance, suppose that there is a big repression of individual liberties. That means that if I am of a religion that is not in power, then I won't be able to publicly express my religious feelings. If it turns out that the government is very liberal, that the situation is of complete individual freedoms, then those differences don't matter much, because I will be able to do my religious practice, the other will be able to do their religious practice, so the cultural distance will not translate into big political oppositions. This is captured by this coefficient pi. Then there is, as I said, a possible money, think of money benefit, so that if it has to be divided up by members of my group. This is of course a simple assumption to make the problem more tractable. So the amount of money mu per capita available, I divide by the percentage of my group, and this is going to be the private benefit of my group. Of course, there are, if you head to government, then it depends, and that's a bit the role of mu. How much rent do you control? No? For instance, in countries that are very rich in oil, I mean, being in government means that you control a huge amount of rents. If your only source of income is taxes, then you are not in such a good position to divert resources to favor your kins. So then the payoff to a person that is member of group I will be, if the group wins, then they will get the most preferred policy, so that they're going to have UII, this is the value of implementing the most preferred policy, times the scale factor, plus the monetary benefit. But if another group wins, group J say, then I'm going to have a utility, a payoff of UIJ, so that's the utility of a member of group I if J is in power, times again the scale factor. Now, then I can form all the expected payoff to an individual, say an individual K, member of group I, And then this is going to be composed of, if group J wins, I'm going to have utility Uij, this multiplied by the scale factor pi, and then this is the probability of this happening. So then I add up over all possible events, so of every group winning, and then that's going to be my expected payoff from the control of government, from the point of view of the public goods control of government. Now, I'm going to have a private benefit only with probability pi, so the probability that my group wins, otherwise I won't have any, and that's going to be my expected private payoff, and I'm going to have a sure cost, which is the cost of me investing an amount R of resources into conflict. So then we enrich this by allowing individuals not be egoistic. And therefore we assume that individuals, well, I'm going to go down here, that individuals may give a weight alpha to the well-being of other members of the group. So that my entire motivation, my entire payoff is going to be the 1 minus alpha, my own personal utility, plus the weight alpha, the utility of my group members. So I'm going to allow individuals, but then I'm going to find empirically whether there is any such factor, okay? But in general, I'm going to allow individuals to care about the group. And I think in the case of social conflict, it seems natural that you are not only fighting for yourself, you are fighting for the well-being of the people you consider are your kins. Now, okay, then all this you develop, and then you have strange expressions. And then what happens there is, so everybody decides how much resources to contribute. This means that we all decide how many resources all my group will contribute. But then, of course, this will be conditional on what the other groups are doing. So if nobody is putting any resources, then I'm going to put very little, because with very little I'm going to win for sure. But if I see the other groups mobilizing massive resources, then I may decide to contribute more. So what we are deciding here is the best response of the members of my group to the level of mobilization that the other groups are achieving. Okay? So I'm going to look for an equilibrium of this game. So that means the situation where when I see what the other groups are doing, I have no incentive in changing my decision, nor anybody else. So that we are in a kind of a stationary situation where everybody is doing what thinks is best, and no one has an incentive to change the decision. And then I'm going to look at this, because precisely by its definition is a stable situation. Then it turns out that, well, we go and I'm going to skip this because, so we go and write what is the final payoff to everybody, and then we choose what is the best action by everybody, and then we get into a strange, what in economics we call first order condition, that characterizes what is the optimal decision, and this condition of what the others are doing. So we have this first order condition for everybody, and then what we do is a trick, in fact, this is a paper that we published in 2011 in American Economic Review, that then we add up all this over all individuals, over all groups, and then it turns out that once you have done this, then we make an approximation of the equilibrium level, and we say when we are in this situation where we are all best response to each other, the win probability is quite close to your group size. So that if your group is 20%, your win probability is not very different than 20%. Okay? Now, making this assumption, then it turns out that then a complex system of equations ends up in a simple linear equation that I'm going to interpret to you, because now it's incomprehensible. But you'll see that it is very intuitive. So this is this equation is this above. Now let me first talk about the left-hand side. In the left-hand side we have, so this rho is the average level of resources that the society is burning in conflict, no, per capita. Okay. Now C prime, this is the marginal cost of those resources. Is how much would cost to a person to spend 1 unit more of resources in conflict. So the product of this times this is in fact can be interpreted as the value of the resources you are putting. So where is the marginal cost, how much would cost put one more, times all the amount of resources we are burning. Okay? So the numerator here is the value of the per capita resources that are being burned. In the denominator, we have the value of what is at stake from the political point of view and what is at stake from the monetary point of view. So we are dividing the cost of the resources employed in conflict over the potential benefit. So this is a measure of the relative intensity of conflict. So if there is 100 on the table, what percentage of these we are ready to burn to obtain this thing? Okay. Now let me go to the right-hand side. Then it turns that in the right-hand side, we obtain a nice linear function of P, that is the degree of polarization, of ethnic polarization in this society. And then I'll tell you how to compute it. Of F, which is the index of fractionalization, G, that is the Gini index, but divided by total population. So now that's first thing. Second thing that is interesting is that we find that in fact this polarization and fractionalization explain the intensity of conflict, not by themselves only, but when they are combined with lambda. Well, this I did not explain, sorry. This is the relative level of publicness in the payoff. So will be, if we think the denominator, lambda will be pi over pi plus mu. So the importance of the public payoff relative to the total benefit possible, okay? And 1 minus lambda will be mu over this thing. So we have that it has to be multiplied by this further, that this index of group commitment multiplies all these things. Okay, it multiplies both polarization and fractionalization, and we have 1 minus lambda multiplying this. But since this is divided by the population and this tiny small, in fact you will see that in the empirical implementation we are going to suppress this. But now let me stop 1 second there, because then it says first, so if there is no group commitment, if alpha is 0, I don't care about my group, I am completely egoistic, then this means that all these measures of ethnic polarization, fractionalization do not explain conflict. Alpha is 0, they have nothing to do with this. And they play more of a role the larger is alpha. So if I empirically find that polarization or fractionalization explain a lot of conflict, then this implicitly tells me that in fact individuals behave as if they were caring about the group, not as pure egoists. Okay? Now secondly, now we have this weight of the public and private payoffs. Let me say a word about this. So we have here 2 kinds of payoffs, okay? Public and private. Now suppose I don't win the money because my group doesn't win, we don't cash the money. Now then, in fact, I should be indifferent about which other group has won, because if only money is at stake, because simply I have not got the money. If it turns out that I care, because then say, well, I am really upset about group B having the money instead of my group A. So then that means that there is an element of publicness, because there is a kind of being outraged by the other group winning. But this is not monetary gain, this is a kind of a moral gain. So then means that we should have this collected in lambda. Lambda could not be 0, because there is part of publicness, there is part of revenge in the payoff. Okay, so that means that if the payoff was completely private, then fractionalization would be the key index. But if the public good is critical, then polarization is the right measure. Why? Well, because in polarization we take into account the cultural distances between groups. Remember that we had group sizes multiplied by how distant groups felt towards each other. So that means that I do care I do. So if there is a lot of public good, I do care whether the group that decides on general policies is group A, group B, or group C. And therefore, the index I need for this society to see whether conflict is likely or not is an index that has to take on board the intergroup distances. Okay? Not unlike the fractionalization index that it doesn't. So then what we do is just to bring these two data. It should end soon, no? It's okay. So now I'm going to bring these two data. In fact, as I said, because of the large population, what we are going, the equation we are going to test is going to be this one. So this X will be a set of controls, and then will be exactly the model. So alpha times 1 minus lambda times F, and here alpha times lambda times P, and then plus the error term, and then these are going to regress this against conflict intensity. So we are going to have here that the dependent variable is conflict intensity. I'm going to tell you in a minute how to measure it. Then the key independent variables will be the importance of material versus moral payoffs, this lambda, the degree of social polarization, and of course we have to measure the intergroup distances. Well, here's delta, so it should be Dij. And then also the sense of group commitment. Now, in addition, we are going to use controls that are standard in the literature, just to make our results also comparable. But we first run our model without controls, and it works wonderfully. And then on top, we add the controls just to be sure that we are not doing anything wrong. So we are using population size, gross domestic product per capita, natural resources, okay, degree of power, and so on. We also have regional dummies, because we don't want the results to be driven by what is happening in a particular region in the world. So we have a dummy for Africa, a dummy for Europe, a dummy for America, okay, because we want to be sure that, as I said, that this is not driven by a particular region in the world. And we also use a lack conflict, because it turns out that a great predictor of conflict today is whether there has been conflict in the past 10 years. So we also use this because we don't want to just take this out. Okay, so now conflict intensity, we have two data. One is the data provided by the Peace Research Office, Oslo in Oslo, and then they have data for all civil conflicts, but it's very primary, so it only tells you whether there have been less than 25 people dead, between 25 and 1,000, or more than 1,000. So we can only have 3 levels of intensity. Okay? Then we use another indicator that is more on social unrest. So in order to not to capture only formal civil wars, but just situations of, I'm so sorry. Well, okay. So in order to capture also situation of social unrest, and then we use data from the cross-national time series data archive, and then these guys collect data from all countries that include political assassinations, number of political prisoners, demonstrations, general strikes, and so on. So it's a finer measure of lower level of conflict, not only big guerrilla warfare. Then about what to do with how do we compute ethnic polarization? First, we need the group sizes, and then these we take from Jim Farron, that he has used lots of data and then has come up with an ethnic structure per country. We don't want to play with data any longer, and he's the most respected specialist in this. So we took the the size of and the different ethnic groups per country from him. And then for cultural distances, what we did is, well, not only that, in fact, we also tested with a different source, which is what is called Ethnologue. This is a database of all languages spoken in the world, and per country, they tell you how many people speaks every language in every country on earth. It's a very detailed data set. Okay? Now, for cultural distances, what we do is we go and pick the languages spoken by each ethnic group in a country, and then we take the language tree, and then we check how far up in the language tree you have to go for these two ethnic groups have spoken the same language at the point. So, and then the idea is the longer ago they split in language, the more likely their cultures have developed different from each other. Okay, so that's the idea. And then we wanted to avoid endogeneity. So we have intergroup distances that are not conditional on today having conflict and hating the other group. It's something that comes far back, is when the two languages split, not how long ago it was. And we take this as a measure of intergroup distance. With this we compute the index of polarization for every country, and then from the world value surveys, then we take the questions in the questionnaire that indicates how concerned about the group persons are, that is whether they do social work, where they help neighbors and all this, and we compute per country the index of group commitment, and we use for all members of a country this as a proxy for alpha. So then we proxy the degree of publicness, the degree of publicness we use as an indicator the degree of political repressions or lack of constraints on the government. So the more unconstrained or more repressive the government is, means that it's going to mean more controlling the government or not controlling the government. If it turns out that there are lots of checks and balances, then you don't care that much who is in power, because that person will not be able anyway to change things much. Okay, so then what is the intensity, what's the importance of the public versus private depends on this, and from the point of view of private, we took oil rents as an indicator of the size of rents that could be controlled if you are in the government and from which you could benefit your own kins. So, okay, boom. And here is the exercise. Now, so we have 1,125 observations, more or less. Here less, but I'll tell you why. So then we have here number of observations. This is the number of countries included. And then the exercise we did is the following. So first columns 1 and 2, and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 differ because 1 uses this data number of deaths in the battle, so this is a prior, and the second one uses this low index of social tension, where there are strikes, demonstrations, and all this. And this is the same for 3 and 4 and 4 and 5. Well, okay, it's impossible. So what we do is the following. First, we introduce just polarization and fractionalization alone, okay? And then say, okay, now I read the model, I understand polarization has a role, fractionalization has a role, so boom, let me drop this in the equation and estimate the parameters. And wow, we find that both polarization and fractionalization are significant in both cases, either if we compute the number of deaths or we compute this level of social unrest. So many people would stop the analysis there. But they say, well, but we have a model, and this model tells us more. It tells that, in fact, these indices enter because they interact with the level of publicness or privateness of the payoff. So then, in here, we have an extended model where we have first the degree of polarization multiplied by the degree of publicness of the payoff and the degree of fractionalization multiplied by the privateness of the payoff. And then we still keep polarization and fractionalization. And then it turns out that alone, they're not significant anymore. So they were significant first because they form part of this interaction with publicness and privateness of the payoff. In the third column, then we take the model completely seriously. And then we also compute per country the degree of commitment to the group, as I said before, based on the world value surveys. And now here, then we have polarization times publicness times degree of group commitment, here fractionalization times privateness times degree of group commitment, as the model says. And then again, we drop the variables by themselves. And then it turns out that we have very nice significant results, especially in here. And again, the indices by themselves, then they are not significant. So what now next is just the conclusion. So let me conclude with these figures there. What have we learned? So first, that we obtained that ethnicity is very important to explain conflict. I mean, here we have indices of ethnic diversity in society, fractionalization, and ethnic polarization, and it turns out that they explain a lot of ethnic conflicts, of social conflicts in society. Of course, with this I have to say that this does not mean that income inequality does not play a role. We have not tested. We just have tested whether ethnicity has a role. And in fact, our now ongoing project is go into income inequality, class differences, but instead of doing it in the simple-minded way, do it like this. So we start with a model, let's compute the equilibrium, let's approximate the equilibrium, and then seeing what the model tells us, then let's test whether this explains or not the existence of conflict. Okay? So first thing, this. Second, now we find that, well, taking theory seriously is not bad, because then we have that in fact it is because those indices are interacted with the degree of publicness and privateness and with the degree of group commitment that they can explain conflict, and we would have made the mistake had we stopped in the first level, because then we'd say, okay, I understood. No, we didn't understand. I mean, you have to go farther. Finally, we have learned something else. We have learned that according to the data, then the drivers of ethnic conflict are not hatred or ancestral animosity, because if they were, then the indices by themselves would be significant. Okay, because then just to attack the other, just because you hate the other, you need not to combine this with economic or political benefits. Okay, so what we learn it is because ethnic diversity happens in a situation where there are economic and political benefits to be made, that then we observe ethnic conflict. But not per se. It's not historical hatred. Okay. So, well, this is I think this the conclusions I wanted to make, and also that in fact this, as I said, explains civil wars as well as social unrest, demonstration, because the other indicator was of this lower scale kind of social conflict. And then again, that insist that in fact there are no regional effects, because we have done two exercises, one to put regional dummies, and the other was just to redo the exercise, dropping one region of the world at a time. So to be sure there was not one region that was driving the results, and it was all significant all the time. There were lots of more regressions that I spared to you because I wanted to concentrate was the key one, and the results are extremely robust to all forms of specifications, different ways of computing things, and so on and so forth. So, well, just to close, so we started saying, well, let's see whether we can say something about social conflict and ethnic differences as potential drivers, and see whether the hypothesis that in the end individuals behave rationally can account for what we observe, or it's just purely irrational hatred and therefore there is nothing to be explained. And then we find that, well, if we assume that then individuals optimize and compute the benefits and so on and try to best respond what the others are doing and so on, then it turns out that we obtain really highly significant results, which I think is good. That doesn't mean that we are taking on board everything, just saying that we obtain solid evidence that those indicators, when combined with economic and political gains, I think can explain quite a lot of social conflict. And this is it. Thank you.